And we're back. After a long hiatus, Beyond Explanation has returned. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. My name is Brandon, and I am joined by the Soulless Samurai. And tonight we're going to go over an episode that we have been working on for, is it safe to say, months?
Yes, maybe even longer than that, because we've discussed this for probably about a year now.
Yeah, and so I'm definitely super excited to bring everybody tonight's show. I want to make sure that I take a minute as we get started to just kind of give a brief warning. The topics and discussions that we're going to get into tonight for some people might be graphic in nature, and probably not a discussion for small children. So the other thing that I wanted to say also is that we realize in the situation that we're going to go over a topic tonight where people did lose their lives. So we want to be very respectful in that, but also we want to have fun. So we just want to say that in any jokes or anything that might be said during the broadcast of this podcast, we certainly don't mean any disrespect. And I don't think I'm speaking for you out of turn in saying that as you go through this and you understand the situation more and look into it more, you start to feel a connection with these people. So I just wanted to make sure that we were very upfront in saying that we want to be respectful in what happened and tell their story the best way that we can. But we also want to make sure that we have a little fun while we do it. So
yes, I think you nailed it. There's a lot of diary entries and stuff that you can read on these people, and you do become very attached to them. But at the same time, there's a reason they call me Soulless. And I do have a dark sense of humor. It's the way I deal with tragedy.
Exactly. And that's the way that I cope with a lot of bad things in life as well. So I just wanted to make sure that we preface it because I want us to be ourselves and I want us to have fun. But in the same respect, I just wanted people to know that we don't mean any disrespect or ill will with any of our jokes. So
it's been 22.3 years. It's finally funny.
Yeah. So I just wanted everybody to know what exactly are we talking about. So tonight's podcast is going to be about the Dyatlov Pass incident. And despite nearly 60 years of speculation about the deaths of 9 hikers in Russia's Ural Mountains in 1959, the Dyatlov Pass incident is still an unsolved mystery. In 1959, the frozen bodies of 9 members of a ski hiking expedition had gone missing weeks before in the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union and were found near a campsite on a mountain that was called Dead Mountain. Made up of mostly students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute a few hundred miles away, the team had set out on the 27th of January to reach another mountain about 7 miles away. After being sidetracked by a snowstorm, they pitched a tent on the eastern slope of the mountain on the 2nd of February. That night, they died. Apart from the fact that they froze to death, no one knows why. So that's going to be what we talk about tonight. We're going to go through who these people were, what is it that they were trying to achieve, and exactly the timeline of their journey that we know about up to this particular point. This is going to be a 2-part podcast. The initial part tonight is going to be, again, about that, the who these people were and the journey that they went on. And then in the second part of this podcast, we're going to get into the actual investigation that happened into this directly following the events. And then also we're going to get into all the theories that may possibly go into what might have happened to these 9 hikers.
And there are already a lot, and we're going to add our own and examine some of the ones that already exist.
So just as we mentioned, the speculation in these books and elsewhere has ranged from the mundane to the crackpot. Avalanches, windstorms, murder, radiation exposure, escaped prisoner attack, death by shockwave or explosion.
Infrasound.
Yep. Death by nuclear waste, UFOs, aliens, a vicious bear attack,
Yeti,
a freak winter tornado. There is literally a cavalcade of possible things that might have happened to these folks. We're going to get into a lot of those things and kind of break down almost each and every one of those in the second part of this podcast. So if you're interested in that, there you go. We'll get into that there. That is also probably going to be where the vast majority of the graphic descriptions might come in, because when we talk about how these people were found, it wasn't pretty. So we'll get into that more in the second part of the podcast. So just want to give everybody a heads up about that up front. So tonight's isn't going to be, I don't think, nearly like that at all. I think tonight's is going to be pretty straightforward, but when we get into the second part where we talk about the investigation, just be heads up, here's your warning, that it's how they were found is not pretty.
The first part is going to be people setting off on a journey, friends trying to better themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, I think one of the things that really brought you and I into this story is that although we are not, it's not like we have a particular affinity for Russia in any way, shape, or form. It's just that we do, though, for hiking. and we've been on different hikes together. We have a couple friends that go out and do it, for several days at a time, sometimes by themselves.
Right.
So it's something that I think to us, we're kind of at that age and in that age group where these types of things are an interest to us. So to see these guys and gals go out and do this, I think is very likely something that it could have been us in another life,
Yeah, that's one thing that makes it such a close story.
So what was it these hikers were trying to achieve? Why would they go out there and brave the elements? So what they were trying to achieve is the highest level of certification for hiking in the country at the time. The trip would require the candidates to cover 186 miles or 300 kilometers of ground, with 1/3 of those miles being in challenging terrain. The minimum duration of the trip was to be 16 days, with no fewer than 8 of those days spent in uninhabited regions and at least 6 nights spent in a tent. If they passed, it would allow them to essentially teach the craft of hiking, if you will, to essentially have the certification of master of sport. And then you could use that to teach people and make a living off of it. It was very particular in what they had to achieve. And part of that also was keeping a very detailed diary and photographs and an account of what happened to you on your trip, so you could prove you did all of these things.
Exactly.
And that's part of the reason why we have these things, to go back and find out what maybe happened.
Right. Yeah, there's diaries, there's lots of pictures. Each member was already an experienced grade 2 hiker with ski tour experience. If they completed this would get them their grade 3 certification, which would make them a master of sport in hiking, and then they could teach, guide. It opened a bunch of doors for you. It was interesting. Recently, I watched the UFC in Russia, and they still have a Master of Sport designation. I think now it's called the Merited Master of Sport, and that's been awarded since 2007. The first Merited Master of Sport of the USSR was awarded to a Soviet boxer, Viktor Makhalov, in 1936.
Awesome.
The program started in 1935, so
it's still something that's going on today in some way, shape, or form.
Yes. Yep.
That's cool. And hey, another thing to mention, because we're about to get into who these people were. I'm going to apologize up front because I am probably going to say someone's name incorrectly, if not multiple people's names incorrectly. So please bear with us on this, because I am not now, nor will I probably ever be fluent in Russian. So,
and if I butcher their names or start nicknaming them, it's just because of my ignorance. I apologize.
It probably would just be easier after a while.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that I wanted to mention, because we don't really get into politics on this show, is that kind of give you a brief idea as to what was going on in the country at the time, so that you have an idea and an understanding as to why, like, kind of what these people were living through in that time at Russia. And I'm not a scholar in history in any way, shape, or form, so I'm just going to take this straight out of the book. So one of the things that I really delved into was, I got a copy of Dead Mountain by Donnie Eicher, and I would highly suggest anyone who is interested in this topic to buy that book. It's very inexpensive. It's a great read. I will not suggest the audiobook. I love you, Donnie. I really appreciate everything that you did, but that was tough to get through. It's like Stephen King. Like, when Stephen King does an audiobook and he's the one that reads the book, it's just very dry. It's like, if
it's not their craft.
Yeah, exactly. It's not your forte. So in that particular instance, I totally understand. But the book itself is written extremely well. It's a great read. I would highly suggest it. This is kind of how it's described in that book. Again, Dead Mountain by Donnie Eicher. In the mid to late 50s, for the first time in decades, young Russians would feel a renewed sense of promise. Sports, the arts, technology, and accessible education were all a part of this. The thaw was an extraordinarily exhilarating time to be young, physically fit, and intellectually curious. And the members of the Dyatlov group were all of these things. So exactly who were these people? And
also, to interject there,
sure,
they didn't have much access to pop culture, however.
No.
Yes, because it was a very secluded country still. So they only had very limited music to listen to. I forget.
They mostly made their own music. to be able to have something to listen to, which is another thing that I think kind of ties them to us, because how many friends did we have, including yourself, that have been in bands, growing up,
Right.
and to make our own music that we enjoy our own way. And these guys did that. Like, if they enjoyed a song, it's not like they were going to hear it anywhere other than going to the movies to watch a movie, which we'll talk about later. They would have to play it. I remember reading something in Donnie Eicher's book about during that time, they would send out like records that were meant to like screw up record players because they didn't want people to have bootleg copies of stuff, or like in the middle of a song, it would scream obscenities or something of that nature, because that was their way of trying to deter people from having like bootleg copies of music.
Okay.
So who were these people? Who were these people that decided to go get this certification, that were crazy and brave enough to try these things? And I think we're going to get into a little bit about that. So the first member of the group that we're going to talk about is Igor Dyatlov. He was 23 years old. He was the group's leader. He was a talented engineer. He designed and assembled a radio and the stove that the campers used on the trip. And one of the things that I think would be interesting to mention about him is he was kind of like the Elvis of camping for like their school. Like, he was the guy that everybody wanted to go camping with. He was the guy that was like the star pupil, if you will, from all of my understanding of reading this. He had gone on multiple excursions before, and everyone always wanted to be on his trips. So the next one is Yuri Durashenko. They were 21, and they were a fourth-year radio engineering student. And they were famous at school for chasing off a bear with a geologist's hammer. And he was once involved in a relationship with one of the other members, Zina. Again, this is going to be one of the first instances you're going to hear about this, and we're going to talk about this again and again. These guys and gals went through extraordinary things in previous trips. So think about that.
And most of them have traveled together before.
Yes. Yeah. So think about that. He fended off a bear with nothing but a hammer.
Yeah, when I think geologist hammer, I'm just picturing like a 6-inch long hammer just for breaking up little rocks.
So I can't only imagine like the stones it would take to face off a bear with something like that.
Yes. He needs a wheelbarrow to carry them around.
So the next one is Ludmila Dubinina. She was 20, a fourth-year student in engineering and economics. During a hike in 1957, she was accidentally shot in the leg by a hunter who accompanied the students. She was known for keeping the group's spirits high while she was carried back to town. We're not even talking about like a couple of miles. She got carried back over 50 miles back into town after being shot in the leg, and she was the one keeping everyone else laughing on the way back.
I guess you kind of have to if you're going to convince them to carry you further.
You better have a good sense of humor if you're going to put everybody through all that.
Yeah. Oh, don't be the grumpy Gus in that group. They'll just leave you.
So it's important to note that in some writings, people noted that she was sharp on the tongue and she was very principled. And she wasn't shy about speaking her mind. So that is something to keep in mind. Next one of the campers is Gregory Kravanchenko. He was 23. And he was the class clown of the group. He also played the mandolin that he brought with him on the hike. And his parents were well-educated and influential people. In 1957, a plutonium plant that he was working at exploded, and he was actually sent in to clean up the plant. He was also detained by police during the trip for singing loudly and kind of panhandling on the train, but we'll get to that in a little bit later. He also worked at a secret nuclear enterprise and was believed to be a recruit of the KGB.
Oh.
So that was, again, Gregory Kravanchenko, 23 years old. And so we're already getting into a little bit of possible people having a backstory that might be a little interesting to what maybe happened to them, considering a possible recruit of the KGB. Also,
right in the middle of the Cold War.
Yeah, and also one of the things that we mentioned was a possible speculation has to deal with radiation. But yet we have a guy who was working at a plutonium plant when it had an accident, and he was the one that had to go in and clean it up. So I don't know how long that stays with you, but I doubt it's a pretty quick thing to get over.
Up until the last few things, I was like, that Yuri K sounds really fun to hang out with.
Yeah.
It went downhill fast.
So the next one on the list is Alexander Kolovatov. He was 24. He was also a fourth-year student as a physics major. He was the fifth of 6 children. His father worked for a gulag until he was found dead. There was no investigation into his father's murder. He was a pretty ordinary kid until he joined the Young Communist League, and this gave him a drive to excel in school and in life. He worked at the Secret Institute of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. Don't know exactly what that was, but it was in the list. He would later work for the Research Institute of Inorganic Material, and they produced nuclear materials. So now we have another guy who possibly had something to do with being in or around radiation. So just keep that in mind for later.
Yes. In that area in particular, in the Ural Mountains, other places in Russia, even in the U.S., there was a place in Tennessee. Right after the Cold War, there was a lot of those places springing up that were manufacturing nuclear weapons that were dark spots on the map. They were secret cities. And there was at least one in the Ural Mountains.
So the next lady that we'll chat about is Zina Kolmogorova. She was 22. She was a fifth-year student of the radio engineering school. She was an experienced hiker. During one of her trips, she was bitten by a viper, and she still continued on that same expedition. She had been on 6 previous expeditions, many led by Igor Dyatlov, and she was said to be very outgoing and energetic. Another one of the things to mention, these are all very young, early 20s folks who I know that they had mentioned in other readings that, they were young, possibly some of them loved each other, possibly some of them had romantic inclinations. I know we had mentioned earlier that Yuri used to date Zina, so we don't really know how much of a role that may or may not have played into anything. I also read in other parts where they were all very, shall we say, innocent in their lives as far as things they'd actually been through in that realm, if you catch my gist.
Gotcha.
Trying to be a little bit of an innuendo here.
Right.
So I don't really know how much that might have played into it, but I know, like, when I was in my early 20s, to be young and in love is not uncommon.
Yes. Yeah, accurate. Especially, I mean, if you spend those kind of times going through hard trials and tribulations with a small group of people, you're going to become attached to them in some regard.
I think it'd be hard not to.
Yes.
Next one is Rustem Slobodin. He was 23. He graduated from the university in 1958. Not much really noted about him other than he was quiet and very athletic. He once made a 300-kilometer trip with his father through sparsely populated mountains. So he also was not someone who was foreign to long trips that were difficult. They had mentioned on that they weren't really sure that they were going to make it, that him and his dad were going to pull it off, and they did. So he was definitely experienced in those areas. Next up, we have Nikolai Brignol. He was 23. He graduated in 1958 with a major in civil engineering and had experience in hiking with various degrees of difficulty. So he was another one. I mean, we're getting radio engineers, civil engineers, people who dealt with inorganic materials. They're not people who are ill-trained, ill-educated. They know, they're smart cookies.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me is, as we're listing these things off, you have these radio engineers and engineers. I've never heard anything mentioned about them having a radio or radioing for help at all.
Igor had a radio that he built that he took on to other expeditions, which is the shortwave radios were actually kind of outlawed at that time. So it was pretty, you were kind of not allowed to have it. He couldn't bring it on this trip because it was so heavy.
Gotcha.
It weighed about 100 pounds to my understanding. And so literally they did not have the pack space to be able to have that radio with them on this trip. I'm glad you brought that up. So next on the list, we have Semyon Zolotaryov. This is one of the ones of the group. He was 38, and this is the member of the group that was kind of surrounded by mystery. Even the man's date of birth is up for some debate. He was drafted in October of 1941 and he went through the entire war without a wound, and he earned 4 military awards. He was also said to have had a large number of tattoos. He was also the only member of the group with an extensive military background. We had the possible recruit of the KGB, but this guy was legit former military.
Yeah, so yeah, won awards in World War II.
And to top it all off, there may actually also be a question of if it's really him that's buried at the cemetery where it's marked.
Yes. Yeah. Intrigue. And he joined the group late. He was not a student. He's the Matthew McConaughey. Hey, you know what they say about college kids. And he was relatively unknown to the party, but he got ingratiated into the group pretty quickly. And I don't know if that speaks for his ability to sneak into situations like that, or if he was just a likable person.
Also, none of his family recall any of his tattoos.
Really?
So that was an interesting thing to note as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that the battalion in which that he was enlisted had an 80% mortality rate. And this guy got through it with no wounds, and he had essentially like 4 purple stars.
Was this guy Neo?
That's a good question,
dodging
man.
bullets on the battlefield.
Had some Matrix stuff that he could pull off. Think about that. This guy already served in a military battalion where most guys didn't make it back. And so clearly he's able to handle himself.
Yes. Either that or he's very good at avoiding dangerous situations.
That's true. And so last is the only person on the trip that actually made it back alive, and it's because they didn't go all the way. And that's Yuri Yudin. At the time of the trip, he was 21 years old. He was the only person to survive. Yuri suffered from sciatica and a lot of other illnesses.
Rheumatism. He was definitely afflicted with a lot of stuff. He left the expedition on January 28th due to illness.
And he actually passed away at the age of 76. So as we mentioned, he had a history of health issues, but he was actually respected for attempting the trip. Like the other people in the group thought he was going to be able to make it. And he was kind of known to do these hikes because it would give him kind of like a renewed sense of exuberance. Like it would give him, it would invigorate him with like a new sense of a lust for life. So they really thought that he was going to be able to make it through the whole thing. But just unfortunately, as things wore on, his afflictions just got the best of him.
Yeah, he passed away in 2013, not that long ago, and lived with this the whole time, knowing he was the only person that left with the group and survived.
So now we know all the hikers, 10 hikers in total that left to go on this trip, 8 guys, 2 girls, and basically one of them is the only one that we had to recount the trip after the fact, but only because they didn't actually end up going through the event that all the rest did. That's kind of unknown. So what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of go through the trip itself. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened, the timeline day by day, and give you the ins and outs of what is known about the trip that the Dyatlov Pass hikers took. So as we mentioned, the trip started on January 23rd of 1959. 9 hikers prepared to depart from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. The 9 hikers would board a train. And one of the interesting things I thought was that when they got their tickets to board the train, they actually didn't have enough money to get enough tickets for everybody. So they actually bought fewer tickets than what they actually needed. And whenever the conductor would come around to take the tickets, some of them would hide. So these are resourceful people. I mean, keep that in mind as we go through all this. We talk about the education that they all had. They were all college educated.
Right.
And now we're showing instances of street smarts. And not only that, they've met in bad situations on previous hikes, and they came out on top.
Right.
So just different things to kind of keep in your mind, little nuggets of information to kind of think about as we go through this. So this is also when the 9 hikers met Zolotaryov. Unknown to everyone but Igor, he was supposed to hike with another group, but the timeline didn't really fit his own. So he was able to connect with the group through like songs and different things, like we mentioned, that essentially, since that was kind of a way that they would relax at the end of a night. They were even talking about how after he met up with the group of people, he knew different songs than they knew. And so it was kind of fun to be like, oh, I didn't know that. Or, oh, this is cool. We get to have this new experience to share together. And that was how he kind of ingratiated himself to the rest of the hiker.
Keeping with the college metaphor, he's like the creepy guy with a guitar that knows all the songs that are like 10 years.
Yeah, there you go. All those super obscure songs.
Yeah.
So the next day, January 24th, 1959, the train that they took arrives in Sarov. Since the next train did not arrive for some time, the group was looking for a way to pass the time. Kurvanashenko pulled out his mandolin, and he put out his hat for tips, and he began to play some songs, mostly in jest as kind of like a way just to kind of pass the time and be happy. But apparently the police weren't really super thrilled about what he did, and he was detained almost immediately and was taken down to the local police station. So after some time of getting yelled at by the local sergeant, they were let go and basically told to not disturb the peace on the train station again.
Why don't you kids go get lost in the woods?
Too soon. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that, like, how little fun was tolerated. You know what I mean? Hey, not only are you doing something with music that's maybe other people would find, like, communist Russia is not going to look fondly upon your merriment, you know?
Yes, yeah, I think it's par for the course. No joy here.
So once released by police, they had some time to explore, and before the next part of the trip, the campers looked for a place to rest, and what they found was a school. And they made a deal with the headmaster that if they told the kids about their trip, they would be allowed to stay. The campers actually got along so well with the students that they even held a sing-along. These guys are all about their music. I think that's so awesome.
I dig it. That's definitely one thing I identified with the whole time.
And by all accounts, when they went to leave, the children even cried because they wanted them to stay behind and kind of like instruct the students. But the campers still boarded the train at about 6:30 p.m. and they rode the train to Ivdale. One thing to note, the hikers made such an impression on these students. And I think that's another thing that as you learn these things, you find out that they were good people. Like wherever they went, people remembered meeting them. So I think it's something that when you have that, it's easy for me. I know when I go through life to try to be as like to be noticed as little as possible.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting to see people that kind of had the opposite of that, like living life to its fullest, and the fact that you left such an impression on them that the kids, when they found out they were missing, actually wrote letters to the Ural Polytechnical Institute asking them what happened to these hikers that they met at their school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's pretty crazy. So moving on, January 25th of 1959, the hikers would arrive in Ivdale. The hikers spent the night at the train station, so the hikers would catch a train to Ivdale proper later on. Later, this location would become a Soviet prison camp, which is something that kind of comes up a lot for the different places that they kind of went through. But there's only really one mention of them meeting a former convict, which we'll get into a little bit later. It doesn't really seem like it made much circumstance on their initial journey, but it is something of note. So the hikers would have had a brief stay in town before catching a bus. There was a 2-hour bus ride to Vichy, and after an extended restroom break, the bus was moving before they realized that Kolovatov was missing. He actually ran after the bus. And eventually, after the fellow hikers were like kind of egging on the driver to give him more time, he was actually able to Forrest Gump it to the bus.
Nice.
And Yuri Yudin actually remembered that he's like, I don't really know why he missed the bus, but he was so scared he wouldn't catch up with them that when he caught them, his eyes were almost bulging out of his head.
So this was important to him.
Yeah, definitely. And they kind of thought that he could handle himself, which is why they were like not really trying to figure out where he was or like keep a hold on his whereabouts.
He a grown man.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't until they were like, I'd already left and the bus was moving until they realized that he was gone.
Gotcha.
So the bus would arrive in Vichy around 2 p.m. on January 24th, and the hikers would split from the hiking group that they had met on the train. They would spend the night before moving on, and the hikers met a local free workers camp leader, and he liked Igor and the group so much that he insisted that they stay with him for the night. The man had a very nice house by all accounts. The hikers said it was like a mansion And the housekeepers apparently were upset because they had to clean the entire house when the hikers left.
Dirty hippies.
And the night before they left, they actually went to the cinema, which Kolovatov and Durashenko stayed behind and kind of like cleaned up the dishes for the night. And apparently they absolutely loved different movies at the cinema that they could go to and see, because it was like their way of experiencing songs and entertainment. And the movie they knew so well that they were able to essentially sing those songs, kind of like the Sound of Music for our generation. It was kind of like Russia's version of that. You could see that they liked each other so much that they even spent time with each other outside of the hike, if you will. Like times that they could have split up and done other stuff and then met up again later, they still hung out for the most part, other than maybe one or two members.
Right. It had similar interests. I mean, if you like to sing and play music together, I guess it makes sense to go see pop culture stuff together as well.
So the next morning, their truck was delayed, and Igor met with a local forester that warned the group against their trip. Yuri Yudin states that maybe this had the opposite effect on Igor that the forester really wanted to have, and instead of him warning him to stay out of the trip, instead it made him feel like, well, I'm going to prove you wrong now, because this is really what we came here to do anyway. So it's kind of like before MapQuest or before Google Maps, you would go to the local forester to find out what it was like, what the roads are like, what's the best path to take, if you will, because they have to know those things for their job. So essentially, he would go there to get a little insider information. But when he went there, the guy was like, yeah, you shouldn't do this. This is really dumb.
You don't want to go down that road.
Yeah. And he's like, dude, we know that this is going to be challenging. It's what we're here for. And it essentially almost cemented the fact that they were going to do it. So it was kind of at this point in the trip that Yuri Yudin started to complain to the group about his physical condition, but he still wanted them to know that he wanted to continue on.
Okay.
So that afternoon, all 10 piled into a woodcutter's truck for the next part of their trip. So we've gone from train to bus to now woodcutter's truck.
Hitchhiking it.
This was a bit of a trip. It was, so the next part's from January 26th through the 28th, again, 1959. The truck would arrive at the Sector 41 camp. The group, it's essentially a work camp. The group met with the workers of the woodcutter camp and had an alcohol-free celebration. Just want to make sure I noted that, because they talked about that in the book, that there was no alcohol consumed and that they very much felt like they did not need it to have fun. They could sing and dance and play songs and music, but they did not need to be imbibed to do so.
Gotcha. They're just high on life.
It's the Mitch Hedberg joke. I used to get high on life, but then I built up a tolerance.
Yes.
So after the celebration, the group got some rest and prepared for the hardest part of the trip. The next morning, Yuri Yudin would wake up in a lot of pain. The group moved on to a geological settlement, which, since Yuri Yudin had an interest in this, he wanted to make sure that he at least made it that far in the trip, because he wanted to take some samples and make sure that he could bring those things back.
Okay.
So to do this, the group took a horse-drawn sleigh that was run by a man named Stanislav, who spent 6 years at Sector 2. This is important because essentially they're saying that he was in jail. He was the group's first encounter with a convict. The trip was about 15 miles, and the group would use skis while the horse and the sleigh would pull their gear.
Okay. So cross-country skiing.
Yep.
I think they had that experience to get their class 2.
So they followed a frozen river to an abandoned settlement of about 20 cabins. And they literally, out of the 20 cabins, only found one that was able to be inhabited for the night for them to get shelter. And the next morning, after they woke up, it became apparent that Yuri Yudin could not continue the trip. After saying his goodbyes, he loaded his supplies into the sleigh and had to ski the 15 miles back, which I thought was interesting because he didn't get to get on the sleigh with Stanislav. He still had to ski his way back. So, and the other thing was, apparently Stanislav was not very happy about how long he was taking to say his goodbyes and gather his supplies, and apparently kept yelling at him to hurry up, which I thought was funny.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
But it was written that it was a group decision. It's not like it was Yuri that, because I was kind of suspect, I'd have to say, over the years of Yuri Yudin, because he's the only one that made it out. And for me to find out that it was more of a group decision, like, bro, I don't think you can handle this. And then everybody collectively said that. It made me feel a little bit better about it because and to be honestly, at first, and of course, I thought the guy that quit was the guy that did it.
Yeah, it makes sense. But he still had to trek the 15 miles home or whatever it was. So he was obviously good enough to make it that far, but they had a goal, they had a mission, and they need to keep a certain pace to survive it. I guess they had to make a decision at one point to dump some unneeded load.
So January 28th through February 1st, 1959. 9 hikers make their way up a river for the final part of their journey. This is the final 5 days. These final 5 days can only be told through pictures and diary entries that was kept by the hikers. This is the part that we probably have the most speculation about, all in all, because we honestly don't really know. We've only pieced together what really happened over these last 5 days. January 28th, day 1 in the wilderness. After the hikers said goodbye to Yuri Yudin, they continued to ski along the Yasva River, eventually adjoining the Aspira River. They would continue this path north to Dead Mountain. The path was extremely punishing, so they would alternate the lead skier. The path had the skiers alternating between essentially frozen over river or riverbanks, depending on if the ice was too fragile on the river itself for them to ski on.
Gotcha. I had read at one point that temperature was somewhere between -15 and -30 degrees Celsius.
I saw accounts of that as well. So their path would become easier when they found tracks and pre-worn paths. The hikers saw sled tracks and reindeer hoof tracks that were clear signs of Mansi hunters.
Santa?
The Mansi were like a group of indigenous people that lived in the area, almost Native American in nature. They hunted the area, but yet it wasn't sacred ground to them. Like they over and over and over again kind of try to hammer that point home in whatever you watch with Dyatlov Pass, is that any account, the Mansi helped in the investigation. They were doing everything they could to try to, like, there's accounts of them saving people who had gone out on similar trips to this, and the Mansi actually saved their lives. So it's a pretty flushed out idea, if you will, that the Mansi didn't do it, even though they were kind of in Mansi territory at times.
Right. They were interviewed extensively in the investigation and all, and everything was concluded that they had no hand in it whatsoever. But yeah, even the Mansi knew this area. Like you said, it wasn't hallowed ground in any regards, but they just knew nothing lived there. Nothing survived up there. And
one of the things that the hikers mentioned, even in their diaries, was they came upon trees that were kind of, they would take the bark off the side of the tree, and then the Mansi would paint symbols on the tree. They had no idea what those symbols meant at the time, but they would come across those quite frequently.
Just all warnings.
It'd be crazy if that's what it was, right?
Yeah.
Don't go any further. Stop now. Do not pass go. So on the first night, each hiker had their assigned task before they were allowed to eat dinner. So during the night, they would essentially, get the tent together, get their supplies, get the fire, all that fun stuff. Once you got done everything that you were supposed to do, then you were allowed to eat dinner, and then they could essentially make music and merriment, have, in-depth discussions like you and I do all the time. It ended up having a little bit of a fun, not fight, but like a fun argument over who was going to sleep next to the stove. Now, you would assume in these crazy temperatures, like we were just talking about, -13, -50 degrees, that you're going to want to be near the hottest part of the tent to be comfortable. But in reality, it had to be so hot to heat the tent that it was almost painful to be that close to it. So they would essentially like draw straws to see who was going to be the person that had to endure the heat all night for when they had to go to sleep.
And who got to sleep in the Goldilocks zone.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So January 29th, day 2 in the wilderness. The second day really wasn't very eventful. The group skied for hours, covering miles of terrain. The group's diary had very little to say of this day. There was some photos of trees with Mansi symbols. The only diary entry mentioned it was -13 degrees with weak wind. Day 3. Here's where we get into a little more of the action. This is January 30th, the third day. On the third day, their trip would get extremely difficult. There was no more Mansi tracks to follow, with the snowpack in some areas being over 4 feet. This would slow their pace considerably. On top of all this, the temperature dropped considerably. It was also more and more wide open, so essentially less tree cover to block you from the wind. And even though the group had lost the Mansi path, they did still continue to see signs of their markings, as we had mentioned just a little bit ago. After a late lunch of brisket, dried bread, sugar, garlic, and coffee, there's a breakfast of champions.
Wow. Yeah, I can't imagine what that tent smelled like.
The group would ski for a few more hours before stopping for the night. The group actually had skied a little too far and had to double back over 200 yards to find a suitable area for camping. This was the most difficult day, and perhaps because of that, their tempers were extremely short. Lyuda and Kolya argued over who was going to be the one that had to sew the tent. Because, of course, as things would go on, you're dealing with extreme conditions. There would be little rips and tears and things that would happen that they'd have to keep up with over time. So after the argument, Kolya acquiesced, ended up giving in, and he worked on the tent, while Lyuda got upset and kind of sequestered herself in her tent. Or in the tent, rather. She didn't have her own tent. Later that night, the group had celebrated the birthday of Doroshenko. This was his 21st and last birthday, unfortunately. It was not spent drinking, but spent splitting a tangerine that was gifted to him from the group. Everyone but Lyuda took part in this because she was still upset about the argument. So the group kind of packed away a single tangerine for him, which was a kind of an exotic fruit, if you will, for them.
Nice sweet treat.
Yeah. And so they gave it to him on his 21st birthday, but instead of eating the whole thing himself, he decided to split it up amongst everybody, so everyone got a piece. Again, showing you how close they all were. And it's, to me, just another symbol of like the friendship that they all had together.
Right. Yeah, definitely a camaraderie.
So January 31st, the fourth day in the wilderness. This is the final day documented in the group's journals. This was because most notes were made in the morning about their previous day. So since that's the case, this was kind of the last time that they had to make entries. Igor did note that they left around 10 a.m. The weather had worsened with aggressive winds from the west. The sky was clear, but it still appeared to be snowing. So he thought maybe it was kind of the wind was so tough or so strong that it was blowing snow off the trees and made it look like it was snowing. So the hikers began to leave the path of the river and make their way up to the slope of Dead Mountain. The group was able to find additional Mansi tracks to kind of help their trip, so they're back into not having to deal with the snowpack as much as earlier. The group still decided to use kind of a smart way of dealing with having to deal with the snow. So they'd have the initial person who was up front take off their backpack. They would use their backpack as kind of like a snow plow, and then they would plow for 5 minutes, essentially, the path. And then they would get to sit on their pack, and then the next person would go. And then when they were done their 5 minutes, everybody catches up. And then the next person goes. Only one person's having to deal with the brunt of having to walk through the deep snow.
Right.
And
That's
then
communism at its finest.
Yeah.
Spread that shit around.
So even with this, though, it was still slow moving. They only got about 1.5 to 2 kilometers per hour. With everyone exhausted, they stopped around 4 p.m. They went south towards the Aspira Valley. Now, the downside of this, of them kind of, they went up the mountain and then kind of had to come back down into the valley of the mountain to camp for that particular night. And the downside of this is that there really wasn't very much firewood for them to find. Right. So instead of them digging a fire pit, they just kind of laid the logs down, made a fire, and then just kind of did their thing, essentially, that particular night. That's really the last night that they had of a full evening to morning experience. So again, to kind of wrap things up here about the final day of part 1 here for the podcast, I wanted to read from an excerpt from the Dead Mountain book by Donnie Eicher. Definitely make sure that you check it out if this subject interests you at all. I highly do recommend the book. It is very informative. Essentially, what Donnie Eicher did was he was the first American to really redo the trip that the Dyatlov Pass hikers took. Obviously, he did it years later, and he did it with more modern technology. But even with that and having snowmobiles and things of that nature, it was still very hard for him to do it. And the interesting thing was that he actually walked away ostensibly, but not really, from his wife and kids at the time because his wife was going through, she was pregnant and was going through all of that when he decided to, like, he got bit by the Dyatlov Pass bug, if you will, and was like, I need to go figure this out.
Deuces.
He spent a large chunk of his life savings to do this trip. He actually got to meet Yuri Yudin. He actually goes through his experience as he essentially, the book bounces back and forth between, you get a part of Dyatlov Pass, you get a part of Donnie Eicher reliving it. Part Dyatlov Pass, part Donnie Eicher reliving it.
Okay.
So it's, I like it, and it's kind of like Games of Thrones-esque, where you're kind of bouncing around a lot. But it's cool because you get to kind of see the experience through his eyes, which would be a lot more like us if one of us were to go do this, and you kind of get an idea of an American who immerses himself in this thing. And it's funny because repeatedly he talks about meeting these Russians, and they're always like, you guys don't have mysteries in America that you're trying to solve? Like, what do you care? So to wrap up, if it's all right, if you'll indulge me, this is going to be a little long, but I really like the way that it's written. And I feel like it'll be a really great way to wrap up what was the final day of these hikers.
I feel like nobody could surmise it better.
So February 1st. Again, this is from Dead Mountain. Friends took approximately 10 photographs on their final day of life, and judging from the first few snaps taken at the campsite that morning, spirits were high. A casual shot of Kolya and Doroshenko reveals them laughing in front of the tent, surrounded by piles of backpacks. Then there are two images of Rustic wearing a jacket that looks like it had been shredded violently. Upon closer inspection, however, it appears that the material was burned, perhaps when left too close to the stove. If Rustic was worried about losing a much-needed layer of warmth, he didn't show it, and instead adopts a pose of inflated pride. After all, of the 9 hikers, Rustic would have been the most able to afford a replacement jacket when he got home. The morning's mood was evidently contagious, and one member of the group drafted the front page of a mock newspaper called the Evening O'Torton, which is the name of the mountain that translates into Dead Mountain.
Right. Yeah, their goal.
Dated February 1st, issue 1. Among its contents was an editorial posing the question, is it possible to keep 9 hikers warm with 1 stove and 1 blanket? Plus an announcement for a daily seminar titled Love and Hiking, to be held in the tent by lecturers Dr. Kolya and a candidate of science, Layuda. The sports page announced that the comrades Doroshenko and Zina set a new world record in competition for stove assembly, while the science pages claimed that the snowman, or Yeti, dwelled in the northern Ural Mountains around Dead Mountain. With the morning's entertainment out of the way, a serious task lay ahead. Constructing a labaz, a temporary storage shelter. The hikers' packs needed to be as light as possible for their journey up the mountain, and items that weren't crucial for the next 2 days had to be stowed for their return trip. After the shelter's construction, the hikers stocked it with the food reserves, extra skis and boots, a spare first aid kit, and most painfully, Gregory's mandolin. Between selecting items for the shelter and stowing firewood for the night of their return, a significant portion of the morning was gone. And after the shelter was secure, they were eager to push ahead. Really quick, I just wanted to note before I finish here, think about that. That was their only form of merriment and entertainment. And they knew this is the serious part of the trip now. This needs to get put away, speaking of the mandolin. And it will be here for us when we get back. They knew it was time for business.
Yeah, they shed anything non-essential, which also, to that point, it obviously doesn't sound like they indulged in alcohol at all, but if they had any kind of unnecessary liquids or anything, it was getting shed here. If they left the mandolin, any other merriment is getting left behind as well.
So the remaining photographs taken that day reveal the 9 friends struggling through a terrain of increasingly sparse trees and blinding weather. There are no happy photos left, just a group of serious young people determined to conquer a challenging landscape. 2 of the images reveal the group skiing single file into a gray haze. Sunset would come at 4:58 that day, with twilight at 5:52. But because of the heavy cloud cover, they thought it best to set up camp early to avoid getting caught in the dark. They chose a spot on the east-facing slope, which would allow them to pack up quickly in the morning and head straight up the mountain. It took several hours to set up camp, and the hikers were in the tent by 9 p.m., ready for the next day's climb. But the 9 would never see the summit of Dead Mountain. In fact, they would never set foot on the mountain at all. The worst night of their lives lay in front of them, and none of them would see the sunrise again. So I think that's a very poignant way to finish out part 1 of the podcast tonight. I think that if you go back and you look at this trip for what we know already, it's very easy to see that these people cared about each other and that they were friends and that there were some wild cards, perhaps. There were some things that maybe could have played into this with all of them, but yet I think even like with us, with like all of our friends, we don't know every single detail about each other's lives. And so but yet I think that we all have to have an understanding that like on the base level that we care about that person and each other. And so there may be things that we don't know about, but maybe we don't need to know about those things. So it could have just been about that. Like, you find out about that ancillary thing and you're like, oh, well, it's interesting if you look at it from 50 feet away, but really it was this. So
right.
I'm definitely looking forward to part 2. In part 2, what we're going to get into is the investigation behind what happened once they realized that the Dyatlov Pass people were missing. We're going to get a lot more into the details of how the hikers were found, what condition they were found in, and also what maybe led into the investigation not going the way that they had hoped. It almost seems, if you go back and look at this, that these 9 hikers were unfortunately destined for this end. There's just so many things that had to happen when they got there. And then not only that, so many things happened to delay the investigation.
Right.
That it almost seemed like it was preordained or predestined to happen. So
yeah,
we'll definitely get into that more in the next. I think the more fun part of the second part of this podcast is going to be us going into the theories. We're, as we mentioned earlier, pretty much everything from UFOs to Yetis to the whole 9. To give you a very small taste, there were orbs that were seen in the sky by multiple sets of hikers around this particular incident.
Yes.
So that may be something that might have played into it. The Mansi people had a long history of the Yeti being a real thing. That maybe could have played into it.
Yes.
Solis found a essentially hidden settlement of people that might have been located around that area. Maybe
City
that
40.
played into it.
Yeah.
There are so many things that could have happened. Perhaps they stumbled upon something from the government, and the government might have had something to do with it.
I don't know. I find it interesting. So many of these theories, there's just enough to leave a little flame of truth in all these theories. So it's going to be really fun to get into them.
Yeah, I think that you can equally find a shred of evidence and equally find a reason to disprove almost every one of them.
Yes, exactly.
So that's what, to me, is the most fascinating thing about this case. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you like, please make sure you subscribe. Honestly, don't think I've ever put as much work into a podcast as I did with this one, and as with Solis as well. So please let us know if you enjoyed it. Please let us know your likes and your comments.
You read a book.
Dude, watched documentaries, read a book, the whole 9. So, hey, again, Donnie Eicher, Dead Mountain. I can't recommend it enough. Definitely make sure you check it out. I don't recommend the audiobook, but the book itself is fantastic. Definitely make sure you read it. Please make sure you tune in for part 2, because that's where we're going to get into really the nuts and bolts of all the super fun stuff with this. Now that everybody knows the basic story, now we're going to get into the more exaggerated bits of the beyond explanation part of this podcast. So again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. For Solis and for myself, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you. Good night.